Here then is what I was able to note immediately after the decapitation. The eyelids and lips of the guillotined man worked in irregular rhythmic contractions for about 5 or 6 seconds, and ceased. The face relaxed, the lids half closed on the eyeballs, exactly as in the dying whom we have occasion to see every day in the exercise of our profession. It was then that I called in a strong, sharp voice, "L'Anguille!" and then saw the eyelids slowly lift up, without any spasmodic contraction, such as happens in everyday life, with people awakened or torn from their thoughts. Next, L'Anguille's eyes were definitely fixed themselves on mine, and the pupils focused themselves. I was not, then, dealing with the sort of vague dull look, without any expression, that can be observed any day in dying people to whom one speaks. I was dealing with undeniably living eyes which were looking at me. After several seconds, the eyelids closed again, slowly and evenly, and the head took on the same appearance as it had before I called out. It was that point when I called out again, and once more, without any spasm, with perhaps more concentration than the first time. I attempted the effect of the third time. The eyes took on. It is leading toward human head function. The brain, a personality, and its surrounding head can be kept functional with supply for as long as that supply lasts. Body. Then it's St. Louis, Missouri, May 1908. Charles Guthrie was a pioneer in the field of organ transplantation. He and a colleague, Alexis Carrel, were the first to master the art of anastomosis, the stitching of one vessel to another without leaks. In those days, the task required great patience and dexterity, and very thin thread. At one point, Guthrie tried sewing with human hair. Having mastered the skill, Guthrie and Carrel went anastomosis happy, transplanting pieces of dog thighs and entire forelimbs, keeping extra kidneys alive outside of bodies, and stitching them into groins. Carrel went to win the Nobel Prize for his contributions to medicine. Guthrie, the meeker and humbler of the two, was rudely overlooked. On May 21st, Guthrie succeeded in grafting one dog's head into the side of another's neck, creating the world's first man-made two-headed dog. The arteries were grafted together such that the blood of the intact dog flowed through the head of the decapitated dog, and then back into the intact dog's neck, where it proceeded to the brain and back into circulation. Guthrie's book, Blood Vessel Surgery and Its Applications, includes a photograph of the historic creature. Were it not for the caption, the photo would seem to be of some rare form of marsupial dog, with large baby's head protruding from a pouch in its mother's fur. The transplanted head was sewn on at the base of the neck, upside down, so that the two dogs are chin to chin, giving an impression of intimacy, despite what must have been at the very least a strained coexistence. I imagine photographs of Guthrie and Carrel around that time having much the same quality. As with Monsieur Gagny's head, too, much time, 20 minutes, had elapsed between the beheading and the moment circulation was restored for the dog's head and brain to regain much function. Guthrie recorded a series of primitive movements and basic reflexes similar to what Laborde and Hayem had observed: pupil contractions, nostril twitchings, boiling movements of the tongue. Only one notation in Guthrie's lab notes gives the impression that the upside-down dog head might have had an awareness of what had taken place. Secretion of tears. Both dogs were euthanized when complications set in about 7 hours after the operation. The first dog heads to enjoy, if that word can be used, full cerebral function were those of transplantation whiz Vladimir Demikov in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Demikov minimized the time that the severed donor head was without oxygen by using blood vessel sewing machines. He transplanted 20 puppy heads, actually head, shoulders, lungs, and forelimbs units with an esophagus that emptied untidily onto the outside of the dog, onto fully grown dogs to see what they'd do and how long they'd last, usually from 2 to 6 days, but in one case as long as 29 days. In his book Experimental Transplantation of Vital Organs, Demikov includes photographs of and lab notes from experiment number 2 on February 24, 1954, the transplantation of a 1-month-old puppy's head and forelimbs to the neck of what appears to be a Siberian husky. The notes portray a lively puppy-like, if not altogether joyous existence on the part of the head. The donor's head eagerly drank water or milk and tugged as if trying to separate itself from the recipient's body. When the recipient was put to bed, the transplanted head bit the finger of a member of the staff until it bled. The donor's head bit the recipient behind the ear, so that the latter yelped and shook his head. Demikov transplant subjects were typically done in by immune reactions. Immunosuppressive drugs weren't yet available, and the immune system of the intact dog would, understandably enough, treat the dog parts grafted into its neck as a hostile invader and proceed accordingly. And so Demikov hit a wall. Having transplanted virtually every piece and combination of pieces of dog onto another dog, he closed up his lab and disappeared into obscurity. If Demikov had known more about immunology, his career might have gone quite differently. He might have realized that the brain enjoys what is known as immunological privilege and can be kept alive on another body's blood supply for weeks without rejection. Because it is protected by the blood-brain barrier, it isn't rejected the way other organs and tissues are. While the mucosal tissues of Guthrie's and Demikov's transplanted dog heads began swelling and hemorrhaging within a day or two of the operation, the brains at autopsy appeared normal. Here is where it begins to get strange. In the mid-1960s, a neurosurgeon named Robert White began experimenting with isolated brain preparations, a living brain taken out of one animal, hooked up to another animal's circulatory system, and kept alive. Unlike Demikov's and Guthrie's whole head transplants, these brains, lacking faces and sensory organs, would live a life confined to memory and thought. Given that many of these dogs' and monkey brains were implanted inside the necks and abdomens of other animals, this could have only been a blessing. While the inside of someone else's abdomen is of moderate interest in a sort of curiosity-seeking surgery channel sort of way, it's not the sort of place you want to settle down to live out the remainder of your years. White figured out that by cooling the brain during the procedure to slow the process by which the cellular damage occurs, a technique used today in organ recovery and transplant operations, it was possible to retain most of the organ's normal functions, which means that the personality, the psyche, the spirit, the soul of those monkeys continued to exist for days on end without its body or any of its senses inside another animal. What must that have been like? What could possibly be the purpose, the justification? Had White been thinking of one day isolating a human brain like this? What kind of person comes up with a plan like this and carries it out? To find out, I decided to go visit White in Cleveland, where he is spending his retirement. We planned to meet at the Metro Healthcare Center, downstairs from the lab where he carried out his historic operations, which has been preserved as a kind of shrine cum media photo op. I was an hour early and spent the time driving up and down Metro Healthcare Drive, looking for a place to sit and have some coffee and review White's papers. There was nothing. I ended up back at the hospital on a patch of grass outside the parking garage. I had heard Cleveland had undergone some sort of renaissance, but apparently it underwent it in some other part of town. Let's just say it wasn't the sort of place I'd want to live out the remainder of my years, though it beats a monkey abdomen, and you can't say that about some neighborhoods. White escorts me through the hospital corridors and stairways, past the neurosurgery department, up the stairs, to his old lab. He is 76 now, thinner than he was at the time of the operations, but elsewise little changed by age. His answers have the rote, patient air you expect from a man who has been asked the same questions 100 times. "Here we are," says White. "Neurological Research Laboratory," says a plaque beside the door, giving away nothing. To step inside is to step back into 1968, before labs went white and stainless. The counters are of a dull black stone, stained with white rings, and the cabinets and drawers are wood. It has been a while since anyone dusted, and ivy has grown over the one window. The fluorescent lights have those old covers that look like icy dividers. "This is where we shouted, 'Eureka!' and danced around," recalls White. There isn't much room for dancing. It's a small, cluttered, low-ceilinged room with a couple of stools for the scientists and a downsized veterinary operating table for the rhesus monkeys. And while White and his colleagues danced, what was going on inside the brain of that monkey? I asked him what he imagined it must have been like to find yourself suddenly reduced to your thoughts. I am, of course, not the first journalist to have asked this question. The legendary Oriana Falici asked it of White's neurophysiologist Leo Massapus in a Look magazine interview in November 1967. "I suspect that without his senses he can think more quickly," Dr. Massaput answered brightly. "What kind of thinking? I don't know. I guess he's primarily a memory, a repository for information stored when he had his flesh. He cannot develop further because he no longer has the nourishment of experience. Yet this, too, is a new experience. White declines to sugarcoat. He mentions the isolation chamber studies of the 1970s, wherein subjects had no sensory input, nothing to hear, see, smell, feel, or taste. These people got as close as you can come, without White's aid, to being brains in a box. People, in these conditions, have literally gone crazy, says White, and it doesn't take all that long. Although insanity, too, is a new experience for most people, no one was likely to volunteer and become one of White's isolated brains. And, of course, White couldn't force anyone to do it, though I imagine Oriana Felici came to mind. Besides, says White, I would question the scientific applicability. What would justify it? So what justified putting a rhesus monkey through it? It turns out the isolated brain experiments were simply a step on the way toward keeping entire heads alive on new bodies. By the time White appeared on the screen, early immunosuppressive drugs were available, and many of the problems of tissue rejection were being resolved. If White and his team worked out the kinks with the brains they found they could be kept functioning, they would move on to whole heads, first monkey heads, and then they hoped human ones. Our conversation has moved from White's lab to a booth in a nearby Middle Eastern restaurant. My recommendation to you is that you never eat baba ganoush, or for that matter, any soft, glistening gray food item, while carrying on a conversation involving monkey brains. White thinks of the operation not as a head transplant, but as a whole body transplant. Think of it this way. Instead of getting 1 or 2 donated organs, a dying recipient gets the entire body of a brain-dead, beating heart cadaver. Unlike Guthrie and Demikov with their multi-headed monsters, White would remove the body donor's head and put the new one on its place. The logical recipient of this new body, as White envisions it, would be a quadriplegic. For one thing, White said, the lifespan of quadriplegics is typically reduced, their organs giving out more quickly than is normal. By putting them, their heads, onto new bodies, he would buy them a decade or 2 of life, without, in their case, much altering their quality of life. High-level quadriplegics are paralyzed from the neck down and require artificial respiration, but everything from the neck up works fine. Ditto the transplanted head. Because no neurosurgeon can yet reconnect severed spinal nerves, the person would still be a quadriplegic, but no longer anyone with a death sentence. The head could hear, taste, see, says White. It could read, hear music, and the neck can be instrumented just like Mr. Reeves is to speak. In 1971, White achieved the unthinkable. He cut the head off one monkey and connected it to the base of the neck of a second, decapitated monkey. The operation lasted 8 hours and required numerous assistants, each having been given detailed instructions, including where to stand and what to say. White went up to the operating room for weeks beforehand and marked off everyone's position on the floor with chalk circles and arrows like a football coach. The first step was to give the monkeys tracheotomies and hook them up to respirators, for their windpipes were about to be severed. Next, White pared the 2 monkeys' necks down to just the spine and the main blood vessels, the 2 carotid arteries carrying blood to the brain and the 2 jugular veins bringing it back to the heart. Then he whittled down the bone and the top of the body donor's neck and capped it with a metal plate, and did the same thing on the bottom of the head. After the vessels were reconnected, the 2 plates were screwed together. Then, using long, flexible tubing, he brought the circulation of the body donor over to supply its new head and sutured the vessels. Finally, the head was cut off from the blood supply of its old body. This is, of course, grossly simplified. I make it sound as though the whole thing could be done with a jackknife and a sewing kit. For more details, I would direct you to the July 1971 issue of Surgery, which contains White's paper on the procedure, complete with pen and ink and illustrations. My favorite illustration shows a monkey body with a faint, ghostly head above its shoulders, indicating where its head had, until recently, been located, and a jaunty arrow arcing across the drawing toward the space above a second monkey body, where the first monkey's head is now situated. The drawing lends a tidy, businesslike neutrality to what must have been a chaotic and exceptionally gruesome operation, much the way airplane emergency exit cards give an orderly workaday air to the interiors of crashing planes. White filmed the operation, but wouldn't, despite protracted begging and wheedling, show me the film. He said it was too bloody.